My name is Attiah, and I'm bringing you today's Country Focus, where we are looking at the North African country of Egypt. So it's been about a year and a half or so since the Egyptian Revolution, and now President Morsi has made some pretty radical changes to the political structure in Egypt, most notably the removal of top military officials from the government. Here to talk with us today is Christopher Reeve Linares, and he is a journalist whose work has appeared in New York Times and the Egypt Independent, as well as the Business Monthly. He was a freelance journalist, working for the Egypt Independent, which was formerly Al Masri Al Yum, last summer, and now has returned to Egypt and can share with us some insights about what he's seen with the ongoing political transformation in Egypt. So welcome to SaharaTV, Chris.
Thanks so much, Karen.
All right. Well, first of all, like I mentioned, you were a reporter last summer and got to sort of witness the ongoing transitions in Egypt as Egypt had overthrown Mubarak and was moving towards trying to sort of sort out how Egyptian society was going to be post-Mubarak. Now you're back. What have you seen as far as some of the mood on the ground, the changes on the ground since your time there last summer?
Right. So last summer, a lot of what I was able to witness were that made the news were protests, largely between protesters and SCAF, the ruling military entity here in Egypt. And there was no president at the time. I'm back a year later, and there's a president. But this kind of the tension before, which had been between people, you had, for example, I'm going to go back to last summer, you had individuals, you had people who were against the SCAF and were fighting against the SCAF and the different entities, the different security forces here in Egypt. And you could, on any given day, see violent kind of confrontations. For example, in Tahrir Square, between there was a very well-publicized event in Abbasiyah, and between protesters and these different entities of security, the central security forces, the military police, etc. And that was kind of what the major conflict was at the time. Now there's a president. He was democratically elected. The most, this is, I would say, the first time Egypt has seen a president that was elected democratically.
Right.
And there is, although there are many people that don't support Morsi, people are kind of buying into the democratic process. And so now you have a civilian leader, Morsi, from the Muslim Brotherhood, who, instead of the protesters kind of going up against the SCAF, you don't see those types of protests anymore. So now it's a governmental type conflict between Morsi and the SCAF. And it's definitely worth noting that the military has been a power in Egypt for many, many decades. And the large, they've been the recipient of US aid and 1.3 billion or so dollars a year. So it's very much entrenched, the military in Egyptian society. And there's also been, and I've written about this, Egyptians have always kind of loved their military. There is, everyone has to serve, so everyone has a connection with the military, fathers, brothers, etc. But what we're seeing now is this kind of this tension between the civilian authority, the Muslim Brotherhood, that many people didn't vote for. If you remember the runoff elections between Shafiq and Morsi, Morsi got about 52% of the vote, Shafiq 48. So there's a lot of people that don't support Morsi or the Muslim Brotherhood. But the conflict between the military and the new civilian government is the conflict that we're seeing at the moment, as opposed to last year, which would have been just people, protesters, protesting the SCAF, the military rulers.
Sure. Now, as far as the military and the relationship of the military to the civilians, if I'm not mistaken, last summer when the military was called in to sort of deal with the protest situation, I remember seeing reports that the military wouldn't harm us. The military won't do anything to us. As far now, is that correct? And has the sort of military-civilian relationship at all shifted since the protest?
That's definitely a sentiment that I heard frequently. The military wouldn't harm us. And I mean, Egypt is, you have all lines of thinking in Egypt. And one thing that I would say was that, the SCAF, or for example, if you had a conflict in the street where you had protests and you had a cracking down on protesters or destroying tents that had been set up in Tahrir Square by the Central Security Forces, a lot of Egyptians would say, well, it wasn't the military, it was the Central Security Forces. So because there are these different security forces, people could say, and the military could say, no, it wasn't us. But people, the belief was it was not the military wasn't against the people. But in fact, from the time Mubarak was out up until recently, it was the SCAF that was in charge, and any other security entity that ended up fighting protesters and injuring people and killing people, it wouldn't have been done without knowledge from SCAF, from the military leadership.
Okay, so moving from the military largely being in charge, and like you said before, the military being fairly entrenched in Egyptian society. Now, what's making headlines this week is that Morsi has dismissed key, very top military heads from the government. Again, I know you've been in Cairo not too long, but I mean, what implications does this have for Egyptian society and for the role of the military, at least so far? It might be too early to tell, but what are some people thinking about this move?
Yeah, it's definitely early, and but it is a very significant move on the part of Morsi, and he's essentially attempting to, if not consolidating, just attempting to consolidate his power and the civilian rule that many people do want. And the situation prior to Tantawi and Anan being forced to retire, you had this kind of duality in terms of governance, and I think it was very complicated for Egyptians as well as for outsiders in terms of foreign policy to determine who was in charge.
Right.
So, for example, this summer we're experiencing here in Egypt water shortages. We're experiencing electricity shortages. We're experiencing crime,
and that's different from before.
Exactly.
Okay.
But when you had this kind of duality between the SCAF, the military, and then the civilian government of Morsi, you didn't necessarily, one wouldn't know who would be held accountable, who's in charge. So one thing that I think is significant in what Morsi has done is assuming that civilian role, and it's going to be assuming that level of accountability that we hope to have in a democratically elected leadership. Being said, many people do not support the Muslim Brotherhood, and even though they didn't like SCAF, the military entity, they saw SCAF as a beacon, as a potential beacon of liberalism and something that would balance Morsi's power and the idea that Egypt may become an Islamic state.
Sure.
So even though people didn't necessarily like one or the other, and actually in the runoff, a lot of people didn't vote. I know I have many friends and acquaintances that didn't vote.
And why not?
They didn't vote because a lot of people they saw Shafiq as representing the Mubarak era and representing the security state. And that security state that we saw in the Mubarak, there was no democracy, there was no respect for human rights, there were a lot of violations of human rights, torture, etc. So people didn't want that. But on the other side, liberal-minded people, the liberals or the leftists, as we read about, they also didn't want Muslim Brotherhood to take power.
Sure.
So a lot of people, for example, may have voted for Sabahi in the first round of the elections, but when the second round came about and it was just Morsi and it was just Shafiq, it can be described as two conservative entities that were kind of butting heads. You didn't really there was no liberal candidate in the runoff.
Sure. So there wasn't really
people,
much of a choice, people felt like, or perhaps, a choice, but kind of two sides of a coin that people might not have been really excited about the whole
Exactly.
Right.
And people boycotted, or some people actually voted for one guy, not because they liked him, but because they disliked the other guy more.
Sure. So interesting. So as far as, again, going back to the first democratically elected president and him wanting to divorce the old sort of regime of a military state from civilian democratic rule. This is what I mean, I hate to say the West, but the West, and particularly the United States, has been promoting in the Middle East and in Africa, and using the Arab Spring, so to speak, as an example of democracy and change. Now, granted, that's also with the flip side that, you know, a lot of aid from the United States went towards the military. So I'm wondering, I mean, maybe some inclinations of how the United States is going to sort of deal with this, because I'm wondering, they got what they wanted. They got a democratically elected government. You know, this is sort of this has been the result of the revolution. But on the other end, I mean, Egypt has been a very important security ally for the United States. So what would be the response to this? How do you think that the United States is going to handle this new development?
I think that the U.S. There's a general foreign policy, and you've explained it and described it well. But I also think that there are differences in terms of how the U.S. engages country, depending on the administration in the U.S. And I do see that the U.S. I actually just read an article where the ambassador here in Cairo was interviewed, and the U.S. does want to engage the new Egyptian leadership. They certainly want to engage the leadership, but obviously there is a threat now. Maybe,
right.
Perhaps Egypt now, especially if the military changes, as we see it changing, even generationally, there's going to be, you know, younger people within the military that are going to be assuming rank that may have a totally different view from older generals like Tantawi, who had, you know, they had been entrenched and receiving the 1.3 billion foreign aid from the U.S. A lot of it is related to just not just having an ally within Egypt, but also related to the agreement between Egypt and Israel,
Right.
and maintaining that peace. So there's definitely some uncertainty, and Egypt could very well, if the military loses or its position, or the position within the Egyptian system of governance changes, Egypt could very well pursue a different foreign policy. Also, there are Gulf states like Qatar that give money to, for example, Islamist groups, etc.
Right.
And you may see a realignment in terms of how a country like Egypt, which is certainly a leader in the Arab world and the Muslim world, how it kind of interacts with external states. And the relationship that Egypt has had with the United States, although $1.3 billion, Washington can certainly influence Egypt, because that is a lot of money, and Egypt is suffering greatly now. I mean, the tourism is suffering, just economic growth and movement is suffering, but we could very well see changes in how Egypt interacts with the U.S. Egypt interacts with its neighbors, with Israel, more engaged between Egypt and Arab states in the Gulf like Qatar, etc.
Sure.
So that's something that I'm going to be looking at.
Yeah, sure. And so one last question, Chris.
Sure.
Moving to actually civil society. So one thing about the Egyptian revolution that kind of caught the attention of the entire world was that this was, well, the perception was that it was a youth-driven, social media-driven revolution. And so I'm wondering, in your experience now, as far as a lot of the young people who are the driving force, or at least perceived to be the driving force behind the revolution, and women also actively, you know, taking a role. I'm wondering now, have the youth seen the fruits of their labor as far as the revolutions? Have women seen the fruits of their struggles? So I'm wondering if maybe in 1 minute you can tell me your thoughts about that.
Sure. In a minute, off the top of my head, there's a lot of disillusionment on the part of leaders of the revolution, individuals that did take to the streets. There's a lot of disillusionment because the Muslim Brotherhood, you know, has power. And even just going back to that runoff election where you ended up with Shafiq and you ended up with Morsi, and you had to choose one of these two and you didn't want either. So there's certainly been a disillusionment on that end. Egypt, a lot of people, I hear, and I heard this last year as well, kind of some people yearn or express some yearning for the days of Mubarak because there was stability, there was security, there were things that people feel now that they lack.
Yeah, I
and
mean,
there's
this
a lot
is a transition. I mean, regardless, it's difficult. It's a transition, and surely there will be people who say, we want the old regime back. At least it was easier.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I think people are still optimistic and are going to move forward. And, I do hear some pessimism. I do hear, to be honest, I do hear some people saying that they want to leave the country.
Wow, okay.
But I also hear other people saying that they're going to wait it out and that democracy is a step-by-step process. Egypt is not familiar with democracy, doesn't
Sure.
have a history. So it's all new to the country. And you have to expect that there's going to be highs and lows.
Sure, definitely. Okay, great. All right. Okay, great. So thank you so much for joining us, Chris. Again, for everyone, Christopher Reeve Linares is a journalist based in Cairo now, fresh in Cairo. He's reported for the New York Times and the Egypt Independent, and you can also follow him on Twitter at NYC Superman, and he is also a fellow classmate of mine. So again, Chris, thank you for being on our show today.
Thank you so much, Karen.
All right, no problem.